Let's dive deep into one technique, interviews. One of the most common ways you'll collect information will be by talking to users. And there are some common techniques that will help this. These can also translate to other techniques like focus groups, but you need a little bit of expertise for that. So we're going to start by hearing again from the NN group about 3 different types of interviews that you can have with users.
It's good to be clear on what kind of interview you might be conducting. There are predominantly 3 types of interview you could perform: a structured interview, a semi-structured interview, or an unstructured interview. So what's the difference? Structured interviews have carefully scripted questions and will be asked by each user and by each interviewer, if there are multiple, in exactly the same way. They often contain lots of closed questions and fewer open questions. Sometimes the interviewer will present the participant with predetermined options to choose from. In structured interviews, interviewers usually do not probe, and as a result, structured interviews are not often used in the early stages of a design project because they don't really generate many new insights. Semi-structured interviews are often used in design projects, and as the name implies, there is some structure there. The interviewer will have a few questions prepared. We call this an interview guide or a discussion guide. These questions are generally open-ended to allow the participant to talk, and then the interviewers will then ask probing follow-up questions. Interviewers have the freedom to change the order of the questions in the guide or to spend longer probing a response to one specific question if they're getting lots of helpful insight from the participant. Lastly, an unstructured interview is an interview where there aren't prepared questions. Although the interviewer might have an idea of some topics that they could cover, the interviewer might just begin the interview asking the participant, "Tell me about your experience planning holidays." The interviewer will keep the conversation moving along with non-leading, probing questions.
The first thing you'll want to do with an interview is plan it. You'll want to decide on one of these techniques, a structured, semi-structured, or open interview. And in 3 for 3, I'm going to recommend just defaulting to semi-structured. You can do a lot with unstructured, and structured can be useful in some contexts too, but really semi-structured is where it's at. Have a script and you identify different roles if you have more people involved. Someone might take notes, where someone might be talking, someone might be operating any recording equipment, etc. So you really want to kind of set up what you want to get out of the interview to begin with.
I always go into an interview with a discussion guide or a script. Now, this guide is a set of questions that we intend to ask and get answers to. Because of the nature of how interviews work, though, you cannot expect that you will get to cover all of the questions on your list, because what happens is when you're asking someone the question, you'll end up asking them follow-up questions. You'll say, "Oh, well, why did you do that?" Or "How did that work out?" Or "Was that what you expected to happen?"
When you get to your interview, you're going to want to set it up in the right way. You're going to want to establish a rapport with your participant. So get a relationship going, make sure you break the ice. With focus groups, this can be even more formal, like actually having an icebreaker activity. With a one-on-one interview, usually just a nice friendly greeting and some small chat will get you a long way. You then want to frame the interview. Give the participant an idea of what your goals are, where you're coming from, why you're doing what you're doing. If you have to keep something secret or hidden, which you probably don't really need to do, you can kind of reveal that later. But it is important to kind of give them an idea of where they want to help out. Participants can be very helpful if they know how to help you. And you want to start by asking some broader questions just to kind of understand where the user is coming from and get an initial sense of the information you're trying to get out of them.
The first section of the interview is what I would call customer intro questions. And these are just questions to kind of be icebreakers, to get to know the person. So we might say, "Hey, tell me what your typical day looks like. What's a day in the life?" And then they'll tell you maybe about their job, their family, their hobbies, etc. Maybe I might want to use this time to get to know a little bit about their relationship with technology. So I might say, "Okay, on an average day, when do you first start using technology?" And then they might say, "Well, I actually check my phone in bed because it's my alarm clock, so I'm laying there and I get on my phone as soon as I wake up."
When asking questions, you want to start general and then get more specific. This gives you an idea of what the participant wants to say without them knowing what you have in mind, and allows you to catch things that you might not have assumed. If you ask the specific questions first, then they're already thinking along the same lines you are, and it really limits what information you're going to get. You can always ask those specific questions later. With a semi-structured or an open interview, interviewing is more like guided talking. You want the other person to talk and then you just kind of nudge them in the right direction. This takes some practice, and this is why assignment 2 is really focused around working through some interviews to get a sense of when you let the other person talk and when you feel like they're going off topic and you want to bring them back without just sort of giving them a question and then cutting them off when you think you have the answer. Letting someone talk and then waiting for them to actually signal that they're done through body language or silence really helps you get that extra information that you might not otherwise catch.
Now we want to dive deeper into the topic of running and fitness. So we might say something like, hey, can you tell me, what's your workout routine? How often do you work out? And they will then tell us maybe how often they work out, what types of exercises they do. Do they do group fitness? Do they do running? Do they belong to a gym? Do they not belong to a gym? They may bring this up all on their own, or those might be follow-up topics that you ask them.
Your interview will be iterative. You'll ask questions, but you might think of new ones, especially if it's semi-structured or unstructured. When your interviewee says something interesting, follow up with them. You might want to do this right away, or you might want to do it later. And this is why notes are very useful for this. When I'm interviewing, I write down little notes, but I use them only for follow-up. I don't rely upon them for later recollection. I really think that you should use a recording device for that as long as you have consent to record the participant. When you're listening to the participant and when you're thinking about possible ways to follow up, pay careful attention to language. For example, any barriers, challenges like, I want to do this, but I can't. Logical links, because of this, I'm not able to do this, or because of this, I do this. Contradictions, they might say one thing and they might say something else, and they may appear to contradict. What this hints at is a deeper truth that you can get at when you kind of challenge them on those contradictions later on. Or what's missing. People might talk about several different topics, but they might avoid something else. And so you might, if you pay close attention, you might be able to query them about that. Being really engaged and open and practicing active listening will really help you when it comes to following up on questions and getting the most you can out of these interviews. You've taken a lot of effort to set these things up and actually engage with your participants, so you might as well get the most information you can. Speaking of recording, should you record your participant? In short, if you have informed consent, they know what you're using this for, and whether it be anonymized or presented, then yes, I think it's totally fair to record. Just make sure they know if it's audio or video, if you're going to show this in a class presentation or not, if it's going to be a blurred face or not, etc. Just kind of understand what they want you to do with the data. If you're unsure about recording, the safest option is to take notes, but you'll want a second person for that. Feel free to recruit someone for assignment 2 or for your projects you'll be working in a group. When you're conducting research, there are many more issues to consider. You'll need to consider where you store your data. You'll need to consider things like power dynamics. You need to consider things like vulnerable populations and how you recruit participants. And finally, how you actually report things in a sensitive way and letting people know that this will actually be published work that can be presented to the wider research community. But for this class, again, you just let people know what you're using it for, whether you'll show it in a presentation, whether it's going to be anonymized or not, and just make sure you understand what they want you to do with the data. As long as you have permission, it's totally fair. Bear in mind that consent can change. So if they call you up later and say, hey, please don't show this data, then I expect you to be ethical about that, and we will, of course, accommodate anything that changes with that. This brings us to assignment 2. Your turn is not actually an activity, but the second assignment. It will give you hands-on experience conducting interviews so you can get this sense of when to ask questions, when to let the participant talk, and how to really plan and follow up. So use this lecture and other online resources to accomplish it. This will give you the skills to complete project milestone 1 and later milestones. So make sure you spend the effort to try and think about it. You'll benefit from this down the line when you're gathering requirements for your design project, for example, or for any other projects you might do in industry. These interviewing skills are really, really valuable. They tie into things like active listening and communication. And if you're able to use these effectively, you'll be able to collect a lot of information and really engage with people in a way that can be really effective for a lot of purposes. The key takeaways from this lesson are that there are lots of ways that you can access potential users. Interviews, focus groups, questionnaires, all of them have advantages and disadvantages. So you should consider using triangulation, which is using 2 or more complementary techniques to get a better picture of the subject that you're studying. interviewing is a skill. There are different ways you can structure interviews: unstructured, semi-structured, and structured. And planning, training, and practice are essential to collecting good information, which is why that I'm really emphasizing this with a full lesson and an assignment. So be able to suggest and execute methods for collecting data. That's so much. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.